Welcome to Reach Minds, Thoughts for Your Life Journey. Today, we will be exploring the concept of polarities, the dynamic tensions that show up across all areas of our lives, whether at home, at work, or in our leadership. Rather than being a problem to be solved, polarities are an ongoing tension that can be managed. Learning to recognize and balance these dualities is crucial for navigating the complexity of modern life. By understanding polarities, we shift away from the binary decision-making towards discovering a third way, a more integrated, nuanced approach that allows us to hold seemingly opposing ideas in a creative tension. The mindset can help us to handle the inevitable dilemmas and competing demands we face with greater skill and resilience. I'm joined today to explore this very subject of polarity thinking by Nicola Maxwell, who is a managing director of Midas Limited. Nicola and her team collaborate with organizations to design and deliver bespoke research development solutions that equip managers and leaders to hold the kind of purposeful, inspiring conversations that drive high performance across individual teams and entire organizations. She's deeply committed to helping leaders develop that polarity mindset shift necessary to lead effectively in today's complex and uncertain world. Welcome, Nicola.
Thank you very much, Nita. Delighted to join you today.
I'm very excited about exploring these polarities of managing both things. My first question is, Nicola, what is polarities?
Yeah, so polarities are almost seemingly opposite states that will coexist over time or should coexist over time in order for you to feel successful. So they're almost interdependent pairs of things. You might also hear them being described as paradoxes or a dilemma, or even that kind of feeling. So, how you'll know if you're facing into polarity is you've got that feeling that you're between a rock and a hard place. Yeah, you're having to make almost what feels like an impossible choice between two things. So a classic metaphor for this, which I often use, is breathing. Because if you think about breathing, you've got two polarities there. You've got the one polarity, which is inhaling. And then on the other side, you've got a polarity, which is about exhaling. And it's not going to be the case that we can choose to do either one or the other. We need to do both in order to actually breathe effectively. So there are lots of examples out there, but that one almost is the classic metaphor that's used to describe them.
And why do we need to pay attention to polarities from your
Well, I think,
perspective?
yeah, I don't know about you, but I definitely sense that the world around us is becoming far more complex. We are having to deal with lots of things that are changing around us. And I think a lot of people are feeling like they're having to navigate seemingly insolvable situations. So for example, if you take this into the workplace, how do we meet our own individual goals whilst also being able to collaborate with others to achieve what's best for the company overall? Or at a company level, how do we make a profit and also ensure that we're sustainable? Those are just a few examples of polarities that we come up against, but there are so many. And actually, once you understand polarities, you kind of see them all around you. So things like structure and flexibility, action and reflection, work and rest, candor, diplomacy. They're all examples of polarities, many of which I think your listeners will probably be able to recognize and identify with themselves.
And do you think that many people see polarity as black and white or cut and dry rather than use it in the way that you're explaining it?
I think often people view polarities as an either or choice. So either I bring structure or I bring flexibility. Either I am competitive or I'm collaborative. And I think that's often the bind that people get themselves into, is that they mistake them as either or choices. And it's not a black and white choice, far from it. But that's what makes it, I think, really hard for people to work with them, because they're much more nebulous than a straightforward choice. And I think the key thing to understand about polarities is that they're not problems to be solved. They're not going to go away. These are just constant things that are constantly there for us in the background. Most difficulties that people encounter with polarities is not because they've chosen the wrong pole to lead into, it's because they've overused that pole and neglected the other one. And so they become too entrenched in one of the two poles.
So, can you give me an example of that, Nicola?
Yeah, if you think about, let's take the example of candor and diplomacy, for example. That would be a good example of a polarity. There's nothing bad about either of those. We want diplomacy just as much as we want candor. But if someone starts to overfocus on one of those poles, what we tend to find is that they then start to experience the negative effects of the downsides of that particular pole. For example, if you think about people being really candid, if someone's really leaning hard into that, then it can come across as abrasive, it can come across as uncaring, as if the person isn't prepared to really collaborate with somebody. They just want to get their truth across. So that would be an example of where someone's leaning in too hard to that particular pole. But we also see this, for me, there's a kind of classic one in organizations which comes up an awful lot, which is the centralized and decentralized pole. And we see this a lot with organizational change. So, for example, if you've got an organization that's decided to centralize because maybe they see it as there's greater efficiencies or it's a bit simpler, it means that people are going to be a bit more aligned, then what happens is that if they over rely on this, they over focus on that centralization, they then begin to experience the downsides of that centralization. So that would be things like the red tape, the bureaucracy, the inflexibility, feeling like it's almost a huge ship that we're trying to turn around. And what that then results in is often that organizations think, centralization isn't working for us. Now we need to decentralize. And so they swing the pendulum almost too far into the other side and thinking that decentralization is the answer. Because what they're now seeking is more agility, more innovation, less duplication, for example. But if they over focus on the decentralization, it then means that those negative downsides could emerge as well. And with that, you might see that you get maybe lack of collaboration or duplication beginning to happen or a lack of alignment. So the key principle here is not to feel like there's a choice to be made. It's a false choice.
Building on what you were saying, wouldn't some people think about centralization? Isn't it about getting polarity is about a compromise?
Yeah, I think often people can almost see this as, are we trying to make a compromise? But if you think about compromises, it often feels like neither side really gets what they want. Yeah, they don't get the benefits of it. So the compromise almost feels like it's not quite a great result from that. So navigating polarities is different from reaching a compromise, because what you're really trying to do is leverage the upsides of both of those poles. So you're trying to look for essentially what we would call a third way. Find the third way that maximizes the benefits of both of those poles and learn how to dance between them. And that's often the phrase that I use when I talk to individuals about their polarities that they're managing themselves. It's about often learning to dance between the two.
I love the idea of the third way, as I said in my introduction. How do you get a leader to change from that kind of mindset of a third way? It's not centralization or decentralization, it's the third way.
Yeah, I think there's an exercise I do with leaders which really gets them to first of all recognize that there is a polarity at work I think that's the first step, is really understanding that there isn't a choice to be made here, that there is a polarity that we're dealing with. So it's not a problem to be solved. But we've all become masters at solving problems. If you think about the education system that we've all grown up in, it really reinforces the value of either or thinking because it really encourages us to find the answer to something. So, unfortunately, we've become masters at either or thinking at the expense of both and thinking. And that's the sort of thinking that we really need when it comes to polarities. So, the first step for anyone, if they're thinking about how do we manage this polarity, is first of all to recognize that's what's at play and then to begin to map that out. So, I often ask individuals to draw a 2 by 2 grid. So, you've then got 4 quadrants. On the left hand side, there would be one polarity that they would name. Let's take an example. Let's say that we're working with structure and flexibility, for example. So you've got maybe an individual that's leading a team. They're really struggling to work out how much structure or flexibility do I give to my team. So they recognize that's their polarity. So structure's on the left and flexibility is on the right. And then what we want to do is then think about what are the upsides of bringing structure into the team. So that we would populate the top left-hand box with a few ideas around what is it that really brings us benefit in terms of the structure. So that might be things like control and predictability. And then we would move to the bottom left-hand box and think about the effects of overusing structure. So that might be things like too much rigidity, less creativity, for example. And then if we come over to the right-hand side of the grid, what we then look at are the upsides, the benefits of using more flexibility within the team. So again, we've got things like creativity, agility featuring in there. And then the final part is to think about the overuses of flexibility. So there might be people feeling that there's no consistency, even unfairness, perhaps. Yeah, favoritism, perhaps coming up. And it's important then to almost lay that out for people and get them to think about how is this playing out for you? What's happening? What are you recognizing as being the upsides of the pole that you're leaning into? And how are the downsides showing up? And that's often what creates the shift for people, is when they recognize that something isn't working well. So often with leaders, it's about them recognizing that actually this isn't really getting me the results that I need. And so there's a recognition that they need to try to balance something out between the two.
So I guess what you're saying is that by having those quadrants that you explain, what you begin to see is the choices that you can bind together and at the same time see if you stuck to the one side of it, where it leads you. And if you're entrenched in it, then if you're over attached to the structure side of it, because of your sense of security, that can have a negative impact, really.
Yes, yeah. So it's really encouraging people. And often, actually, people will recognize it in themselves because often they're coming into whether it's a coaching session or perhaps it's a development program that they're taking part in. Often they will be aware of some kind of pain point that they're experiencing. And there's different ways that you can spot that you're dealing with a polarity, for example. If something feels like it's just been ongoing, so I haven't been able to solve this particular problem that I'm having and it just keeps coming up for me, that's a pretty good sign that you're dealing with a polarity.
I can think about me struggling with actually a problem and I'm thinking either or rather than what's the kind of solution that can enrich in my decision making. So it stops me from moving forward. It's interesting that. So do you think that being able to navigate and manage polarities, is that something that's a learned skill or is it innate in some people and not in others?
I think it's certainly something that people, in my experience, more consciously learn. And often it's through those interactions that we have with them as coaches, as trainers, as facilitators, that they almost have that moment where they recognize that, that this is what's going on for me, and this is why I'm having these challenges and I don't seem to be able to overcome it. So yeah, a lot of people will use the phrase, I just feel like I'm in over my head. I'm not coping with something. And that's often a really strong signal that we're dealing with a polarity, because it's trying to solve that problem hasn't worked. And so it's then starting to have that conversation around how do we learn to navigate the polarity rather than solve the polarity.
So, at an individual level, Nicola, would you do the same as in your example, the organizational example that you gave about the four quadrants? You use the same process
Yes, yes.
when
And it's,
dealing with an individual.
yeah, absolutely. And I think to go further than that initial process is also to help people think about what are the early warning signs that I need to watch out for that will tell me that I've gone too far. I've leant too hard into that pole of the structure or the flexibility, for example. So, for instance, we go back to that example for structure. An early warning sign might be that you recognize that your team are no longer offering up ideas in meetings, or maybe there are just too many meetings that are happening because we're trying to control things and keep hold of things really tightly. On the opposite side, for flexibility, the early warning signs could be that perhaps projects are not being finished. Perhaps the meetings that we do have feel really unstructured, like they don't really have a clear purpose. So that would be the next step that I would be encouraging people to really think about is what are those early warning signs that are going to come up? And then from there, it's about really identifying some steps that you can take to begin to rebalance everything. So now you've got the kind of the early warning signs that are going off. You can recognize that. What is it that you can do to just begin to ensure that you get the benefits and the upsides of both of those poles? So it might be that, say, you're leaning too hard into the structure side of things. One of the action steps you might identify is that you need to add a bit more breathing room to the meeting agenda, perhaps just create a bit more space for those ideas or that discussion to flourish, and perhaps invite greater experimentation within the team as well.
It makes me think at an individual level, some examples in organization, work-life balance.
Oh, yes.
It's a great one. Should I be working 50, 100 hours, or
Yeah.
should I put it's an either or? And often I think I've seen leaders sort of balance that, actually not balance it. I've got to work 100 hours or my family. Another areas that I've seen people seen evidence of a lack of polarity is, should I take that job or shall I move into that country? It's about having that conversation with yourself and saying, what are the upside and what are the maybe
Yes.
some downside with this, and what would be the dance in between, as you were describing, to leading to that decision, rather than I hear you saying, here's a problem to solve. So if we reframe it away from it being a problem, then maybe there's more spaciousness around that.
That's right. Yeah, and more openness to possibilities in terms of what solutions could emerge as a result. And I think it's also important to say that the world is full of either or choices. So we actually need to hold this together. So it's not that we need to just do the both and thinking. Yeah, there are places for either or thinking. So for example, when you're maybe in a decision around should we hire person A or person B for this role, it's an either or choice that you're making at that point. Or do we go on holiday to relax, or are we going to go and do something that's a bit more active? Again, it's an either or choice. So it's just about ensuring that we're really working that muscle of both and thinking equally as hard as we're working the muscle of either or thinking, which is the one that's really been trained so well through the education system, particularly.
I can see that as well. If someone wants to develop this part of their own thinking and learn to navigate it in a conscious way, what would be some of the tips and insights you suggest they start looking at?
Going back to the quadrant exercise that we talked about, clearly that's a great way to start thinking about polarities. And I think there's almost that very first stage of being able to recognize the polarity. I think a lot of that is about tuning into how you're feeling, what's going on for you in that moment. The example you mentioned earlier around work and rest is a really good one to take in respect of that, because what I am noticing is that a lot of leaders are leaning quite heavily into the work pole at the expense of neglecting the rest pole. So, one of the things I would be encouraging them to do is really think about, so, first of all, what are the benefits of leaning into that work pole? And of course, for many leaders, they'll feel very fulfilled, they'll feel very productive, financial security. So, there's many advantages of that. If we lean too hard into that and we overdo it and we're working too many hours, then it's really helping them think about what does that result in for you. So that could be things like stress, burnout, maybe feeling unhealthy, relationships start to suffer, but also going beyond that and helping them think about, and where does that show up in terms of how you're feeling, not just emotionally, but also physically as well. So trying to tap into some of the kind of signs that will tell us that we're leaning in too hard. And with the work pole, of course, some of those signs can be really obvious for people in terms of particularly the health indicators that tell us actually we're not really balancing this pole particularly well. And we need to find a way to pull in more of the benefits of the rest side of the polarities.
That's a great example because I think in today's volatile, complex world, people are less willing to work with a model that were around in organization in the 50s and the 60s, that you worked in the office and you neglected your personal life and your children grew up and you thought, who are these individuals? I think there's more of a sense around it's not the question of having it all, it's about how can you balance
Yes.
that aspects of the two axes in your life. And sometimes it won't be in balance, and other times
Yeah.
it will be. And I think it takes intentionality to do that. So as I'm listening
Yes.
to you, I think polarity is an intentionality rather than
Mm.
it's something that won't come automatic to us. It's something that we need to think about. And as you were saying earlier on with the structure versus flexibility or centralization or decentralization, there are benefits,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
organizations need to have that kind of complexity of thinking that everything is not a reductionist, I think, where I believe either or thinking comes into it.
Yeah, that's very much kind of that zero sum mentality, isn't it? Where people see it as, well, either it's this or it's this, but it can't ever be both. And the way to really think about the polarities is that you're almost trying to, it's like taking two pieces of rope and trying to braid them together so you get that blend. So often we're talking about the blend or the balance when it comes to polarities, and recognizing that, as you said, Nita, we're not always going to get it right. There will be times when we do lean in a bit too hard. The important thing is that we notice that in ourselves. We're tuning into what are the signs that are telling me this is happening, whether that is within our own mind, our own body, or things that we're noticing in the external environment as well.
Yeah, and I think for me, the sort of one of the takeaways from our conversation is polarity is so powerful because it steers you away from a problem that needs to be solved. Of course, there is something to be solved.
Yeah.
However, it's not a problem. It's about what's the richness that can come from different perspectives. And I love your metaphor of the rope because it's so rich and I can certainly visualize it. So as we bring our conversation to a close, what's the kind of motto? I always like to ask my guests, what's the motto do they live by in their lives?
It's related to polarities, actually, because my motto is that life is a balancing act.
Wow.
And I've really found that to be true in all different aspects of my life. So even if I think about raising children, yeah, I often talk about how the balancing act is between ensuring that they have that independence themselves and also that we're bringing in a bit of that structure or that responsibility for them as well. So it's always about, the analogy I use is letting go of the reins. When do you need to let go of the reins and when do you need to hold the reins a bit more tightly? And that's an example of a polarity. For anybody who has brought up children, I'm sure that'll be very familiar to them.
Yes. Too familiar, I think, in many ways. Not always getting it right in my book.
That's exactly it, isn't it? As parents, we're constantly trying to work out that dance between the two. And also we can think of examples when we might have leant too hard into one of those poles. And unfortunately, then we've experienced the downsides of that. And that's when we then think, okay, we need to correct this and maybe ease off a little bit. So it's a bit like kind of another analogy might be the use of the accelerator and the brake with the polarities as well.
Yeah, and I can certainly resonate with all of that. Nicola, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. It made me think about, how do I manage polarity? Where do I lean in? And where do I need to lean in more? Because I realize it's a mindset one needs to develop. It's not something that is automatically present in all of us. Maybe it's in some people, but certainly it's not in me anyway.
And I think that's true of many people. Absolutely, Nita. I think the awareness that you can bring to this, once you start looking at polarities, you do see them all around you.
Thank you so much, Nicola.
Thank you.
If you're interested in working with me, connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or www.nitasharma.com. And if you enjoyed the podcast, why not consider subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you have access to your podcast, and leave a review.